originally born and raised in a pretty rural county, uh, Fayette County, Alabama. Uh, I grew up basically in a house where you couldn't see any houses around mine, and but the houses that were semi-close were all relatives. I know a lot of people live in communities like that, little country communities. Um, so from as young as I can almost remember, I've always had a fishing pole in my hand or spent a lot of time in the outdoors. Uh, as soon as we were old enough, we were trapping. I can remember checking trap lines in the mornings before daylight on a bicycle, even walking to a trap line because we were, too young to drive vehicles at that time. And country kids, they start driving vehicles really early in life down in the country. So that's kind of the way I grew up. Loved turkey hunting and loved trapping and things along that line. Uh, as I got older, when I graduated high school, I was lucky enough to get a couple of scholarships. It probably is the only reason that I was able to even, further my education because we grew up kind of poor. Uh, so I ended up going to Tennessee to college in Tennessee, and of course ended up getting a 4-year degree there, and eventually moved on to Nashville, Tennessee, which is a large metropolitan city, which was quite the shock, to go from this little town in Alabama to where we graduated, I think 28 people out of my high school class to go to this city. Um, I went there like a lot of people do in the music business. I was a singer, and I found out very quickly how difficult that was. I always tell people that if you live in Nashville, you can roll your window down and spit gum out the window and hit a really good singer just driving down the street. So I learned that pretty quickly. And for a couple of years, I did that and starved while doing it. And eventually I got into law enforcement, spent the next 20 years doing that. The majority of that time in law enforcement, I was a canine handler. So I handled several different service dogs over the years that did several different, trained to do different types of jobs. Um, and during that time of a little over 20 years, I worked almost every day with the same people, the way a lot of people do. But I became friends with a man that worked with me. We spent a lot of the time together during the days while we were at work, went on a lot of our same calls together. So any type of police call you can think of that happens in a large metropolitan city during the height of the crack epidemic back then, well, we went on it together. And during that time, I found out that he was a bow hunter. He loved to bow hunt. And that's really something I had never done growing up. Well, not many people around where I lived, bow hunted or shot bows or anything for that matter. And I found out that he was a bow hunter. And he retired a couple of years before I did. And then when I took my retirement after a little after over 20 years, I had kept in touch with him, and I was talking to him one day, and he said, "Why don't we go up and camp out where I go and bow hunt at?" And I said, "That'll be great," because I wanted to get more back to the outdoors again and start doing outdoor things again, just from really living in a congested city for years and years. And he did all of his hunting and fishing and camping and stuff at a place called Land Between the Lakes, which we call LBL. And for anybody that's not familiar with it, I wasn't. Land Between the Lakes is classified as a national recreation area, and it's in north central Tennessee, and it starts in a little town called Dover, Tennessee, and it runs north up into Kentucky, almost like if you took a rectangle and you turned it up on its end long ways. It runs up into Kentucky like that. And there's a road that cuts straight down the middle of LBL that's called the Trace. The Woodlands Trace is what it's called. We all call it the Trace. So he and I made arrangements, and I really drove to his house to follow him up there to LBL. And of course, we drove up there. We got on the Trace, and we went for miles and miles, and it was just beautiful. There's no homes in there. There used to be lots of homesteads in this area of the country, and we got up there, and eventually we just kind of turned off to just a nondescript little dirt road, and it was beautiful. It really reminded me of where I had come from and been raised at Alabama. Well, we turned off on this little dirt road, and I was kind of writing down directions as we were going, and I reset the odometer on my vehicle, and we drove out that little road about 8 or 9 miles through some of the prettiest old growth hardwoods, deep hollows. Some of those hollows were so deep that when you got down in there driving, I mean, it was just, downright gloomy, in the woods down there. Just really beautiful. Almost looked like the Pacific Northwest, the way the trees were down there, and lots of moss on the trees, and it was really jungly down in there. And we drove back in there 8 or 9 miles, and made a couple of little cutoffs, and eventually we turned onto a little cemetery road way off in there, about 9 miles. Anybody who's ever visited Land Between the Lakes, you would know that there's lots and lots of cemeteries at LBL from all the homesteads that used to be in there. So there's easily over 100 cemeteries. I used to know the exact number. I forget the exact number now. But we had turned off on one of these little cemetery roads and drove back into this road, maybe another half mile or a mile, till we passed this little cemetery. And eventually we kind of broke out into a little clearing past the cemetery, and he had the prettiest camping spot right on a small bay at LBL. Just really pretty. There's a little clearing there, maybe about 15 yards by 30 yards, and you could drive right down to the water. So, of course, that's where he'd been camping at for years. He had also told me on several occasions that he used to camp across the bay at another campsite across the bay, but they had closed that road down to where he couldn't get in there anymore. So this has been his new campsite for quite a few years at this time. And what we would do at this place is we always had a little flat bottom aluminum john boat, and I mean a little small boat, big enough, small enough to where we could pick it up off the trailer. The two of us could, and we could actually sit it in the water, and we would put a little trolling motor on the back of it with a battery, and we would just kind of troll around in this little bay and fish. We would set, for anybody from the South, we would jug fish, where we'd drop jugs out and fish for catfish, and we kind of use it as a base for our fishing and for our hunting during hunting season. One thing about LBL is during hunting season, when deer season is in, you can't gun hunt. You can't hunt with rifles and stuff like you do it normally. There's a few days a year when you can draw for rifle hunts, and after that, it's nothing but bow hunting, which I think really kind of is kind of neat. So we would kind of use this as our base to hunt from, and there were a few little islands around there close to us. So we would take our little boat and go across onto these islands and the only tree stands that you were allowed to use, and you're still allowed to use at LBL, are the portable kind that you climb in. So a lot of times we would cut out from our base camp either in that little boat or kayak or walking with one of those climbing tree stands strapped on our back, and we go out there and hunt. So that really was what we did there, all the time. I'll say this because this is pretty significant. Shortly after we started going there, he always had a little dog that he brought with him for camping, which passed away, maybe a year or two after we started camping there. Well, I acquired me a dog just since I was a canine handler. I've always, loved dogs. I got me a little dog because since I was spending more time outdoors, I just wanted to have take with me. So I got me a little dog, and his name is Moose, and he's a mountain feist. Well, I started carrying him there probably at 7 months old. He's a little rescue dog. So within a week of me getting this little dog, he was, getting drug in and out of kayaks and boats, and was out in the middle of the woods, things along that line. Now we had been camping and fishing there and hunting there for I don't know how long, and several times a year we would go there. I mean, sometimes we would go once a month and stay 3 or 4 or 5 days at a time. So we were there, pretty frequently, always kind of doing the same thing when we were there. Well, we'd been I probably started camping with him there about maybe 2012, and I'd been camping there maybe about 3 years with him. One time we came in, and everything was always the same when we went there, except one time when we came in, there had been a controlled forest burn that they had done in that area, which I'd never seen them do before, but they do that a lot up there, take down a lot of the underbrush and stuff like that. And I'd noticed they'd done a forest burn, maybe a month before we had been there. So, new stuff was starting to grow, but I could tell that they had burned it off. Well, we happened to be sitting there around the same fire pit that we'd built years ago out of rocks, and just kind of sitting there in our camping chairs. And if you can picture this, we were sitting around this fire pit with our backs to this bay. In front of us is a pretty heavy thicket that's grown up in briars and blackberry bushes, a lot of small saplings, like a grove of small sweet gums had grown up in there. And this thicket was probably 100 yards through this thicket. And then you hit that cemetery that was up there at the top of the hill. So we're just sitting there like we normally do, like we'd done hundreds of times, and he had done it a lot more than that. I'm sitting in a chair, he's sitting in a chair. Moose is spoiled, so he's sitting in his own chair, curled up asleep. And off to my right, there's a really loud splash in the water. Now, I tell people this all the time. If you ever camped out at LBL, there's Asian carp up there. There's always stuff splashing in the water. You hear all kinds of seemingly exotic birds screaming and squawking. It's almost like you're in the Amazon when you're there. There's all kinds of, stuff going on. So it's not like we're not used to, hearing things, but this was a really big splash. And the thing that caught my attention about it was, if anybody's ever taken a big giant rock and thrown it in the water, when the rock goes in the water and it sucks the water down with it and it closes in behind it, you get that real deep kersploosh noise when it hits the water. And that was the noise that it made. So that's really what caught my attention. And so I kind of cut my eyes to the right, and I'm listening to it. And I even said something to him. I said the words "big splash" when it was like that. Of course, he didn't really pay any attention. We're just both, looking at the fire. Maybe about 60 seconds later, 45 seconds later, well, then there's another big splash, the same kind of sounding splash. And that time Moose, he, got his head up. He's kind of looking that way too. And I thought, man, and that time I said something to him. I said, man, did you hear that? And he's a little older than I am, so he doesn't have the greatest hearing in the world. He said, well, I didn't hear anything, but it was clearly, I could hear it clearly. Over a period of probably about 4 or 5 minutes, I heard several loud splashes, maybe 5 or 6 splashes. And it was almost like it gave me a feeling of, anybody sitting there would have thought this isn't normal. This just doesn't sound normal. So I kind of got the idea in my mind. I thought I'm going to ease down there to the water. And it looked like there used to be maybe an old place where you could launch your boats at down there. The land kind of went out into the water a little further than the rest of the shore. So you could kind of walk out there. And I thought, man, I'm going to ease down there. And I had a little spotlight at that time. And we would use that spotlight to shine the bait to look at our jugs we were fishing with at night. And if we saw one of our jugs out there getting drug around, we'd go out there and check it. So I just thought, man, the next splash I hear, I'm going to ease down there and see what this is, or see if I can see what it is. So, of course, the next splash I heard, I eased out of my chair. Moose got up, and I started kind of creeping down there towards the water with my light off. Left my buddy sitting back there at the fire by himself. And the way we camped, when he and I went, he had one of those on top truck campers where you sleep over the top of the cab of the truck. Me, I was a tent camper. So my tent was always up in one corner of that little clearing, backed up to the woods. And of course, since it was his camping spot, he always had the primo spot under a big shade tree there. He'd just pull his truck up under there. Well, I eased by his truck and I walked down there to the end, and there's some growth of stuff on each side of the roads. And I kind of crouched down and I got all the way out to the end. And I thought, if I hear the splash again, I'm going to, hit that spotlight and I'm going to shine it across there and see if I can see anything. And sure enough, in just a minute, there was that loud splash again. Well, I flipped that spotlight on, and it had been pretty warm during the days and it was cool at night. So the water was warm. So there was a little layer of fog across that water because the water was warmer than the temperature of the air outside. And my goal was, if I can't see what it is, maybe I can at least see where the waves, are emanating from, and kind of, narrow it down as to where whatever's landing in the water is landing in the water. Well, I couldn't see. There's just, fog on the water there. But I shined around. I didn't see anything. And there was almost like a little slough up in there. And for most country folks know what a slough is. That's where the water kind of runs up into the woods and you have lots of sticks sticking up out of the water and things along that line. And so I kind of shined across that little slough there where I thought it was coming from, but I didn't, see anything. Well, I went back, and by the time I got back to the chair, this was along about maybe 11 o'clock at night, somewhere around that time. And he was getting up, starting to mess around to go get into his camper. And I told him, I said, man, didn't you hear that splashing over there? And he goes, oh, you kind of have to know him. He goes, oh, man, there's always stuff splashing and, stuff around here. And he kind of discounted it and went on to bed. I stayed up a few more minutes and got close to the fire and got good and warm. Then I went and got into my tent. Of course, Moose went in there and got in there with me. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop thinking about those noises that I was hearing. It was almost like I was trying to rationalize what it was, but it was so far out of the norm from anything that was in the catalog of my brain, I guess you could say, as to things we'd heard there. I laid there awake for a while. I never did, hear anything the rest of that night. And that we'd been there maybe that was our third or fourth night there. So the next morning, of course, we had already planned on packing up and leaving. Well, I went home, and I tell people this is probably either one of the best things I've ever done or one of the worst things you could ever do. I got on the internet, and uh, and I'm just kind of looking at stuff on the internet. And honestly, I typed in something so generalized, something along the lines of what throws large rocks into the water at LBL, or really something along that line. It's almost comical when I think back on it, after all some of the things I've done in my career, for me to just type something like that in there. If you do that, there's just so many things comes up about Land Between the Lakes. There's so many stories about the folklore, and that's when I started reading stories from there about Bigfoot, or things that they call a dog man, which is maybe the equivalent of what we would call a werewolf, an upright walking canine. So there's all these stories. I start reading through all these stories. Uh, Lots of podcasts and shows like yours about things that happen at LBL and things that have happened to people there and along that line. And it was probably my buddy. He hurt his back, so he was kind of laid up or was hanging around his house for the next couple of months. So I had a couple of months to sit and sift through some really crazy stuff, some pretty wild stories from up there. But it also allowed me to read a lot about the history of the area and things along that line, which is something that I always enjoy. Well, sometime while he was laid up, I guess he was on eBay or one of those sites or something. He came up. We had always talked about how great it would be to have a little houseboat, and how we could sit out in the middle of that bay at night and just sit on top of that little boat and look at the stars, because it was always so beautiful out there. It's really a place where you can go and get away from a lot of light pollution, see the stars and the Milky Way and stuff like that. So sometime while he was kind of laid up sick, he acquired this little pontoon houseboat that he bought used from somebody. And of course, he was excited, and I was excited too, about him getting it. He had to go somewhere up into Kentucky to pick up this little houseboat at a marina, and he was going to go up there and just get this little boat, and he was going to, we have maps and stuff of Land Between the Lakes, and he was just going to bring it down through all the different waterways and really just come right to the bay where we camped out at. So that was what our plan was. And he went up and got the little boat, and it took him a good couple of nights or couple of days to bring this little thing down there. Now, if you can imagine the size of this thing, on the inside, it really wasn't much bigger than his little on top truck camper is. It had 3 flat pontoons on the bottom. It had a little tiny kitchen and a little place to sleep. I mean, it was really a little small, tiny thing. So he was going to bring that thing down, and I was going to meet him. We were all excited. And what we had decided and had talked about for a long time while we've been there, probably a couple of years, we talked about how sometime we would like to go across the bay and stay at the old campsite where he used to camp out over there. So, of course, I loaded Moose up, and up there we went. And I drove into the same spot, and of course, he wasn't there. He's bringing this boat down. And I probably spent a couple of hours there, getting my stuff kind of that I usually camp with into one big plastic tote, a big storage tote. and waited for him to show up. And eventually he showed up in this little tiny pontoon houseboat. Uh, Even though the thing didn't sit down in the water that deep, he couldn't get all the way up close to the bank. So I ended up picking Moose up, carrying him out there in about waist deep water and putting him on this little boat. And then I carried that toad out there and put it on the boat. And across the bay we went. And we decided that we were going to camp up in a slough across the other side of the bay there. Well, when we got over there, his campsite that he had used before wasn't even discernible. It's so grown up, jungly over there that there really wasn't a campsite. Uh, the road that goes in there, we had walked that old road that he used to drive in there, and they really had came in and dumped. It looked like dump truck loads of rock and dirt there, just like big, giant, huge humps. And they were all grown up in trees and weeds and stuff. But when we got over there and got to looking, there was one place where the water, if it came a good rain, it would come down out of this hollow, and it had kind of washed gravel and stuff down. So there was a little small gravel bar over there. And I mean small. I used to camp in a little 2-person tent back then, and it was just big enough to kind of put this little tent out there and stake it down. So we got over there and backed that little houseboat up, and I think we were probably able to get probably 10 yards from the bank, as shallow as it was. And of course, I got my toad out and held it over my head and waded out across there, and got my tent and stuff set up. Well, since we wasn't doing our normal camping where he would bring the little John boat when he drove, he did have that little pontoon came with a houseboat. I mean, with a kayak with it. So he had a little kayak on the strap to the side of this thing. And as soon as I got set up, and it wasn't uncommon, he said, "Man, I'm going to go, fish a while, till it starts getting dark. I'm going to go get in this little kayak and go fish." I said, "Great." So he hops in that little kayak and puts his stuff in there, and he paddles out and around the corner and disappears. And we had backed this houseboat up to where it was facing west, where we could see the sunset on this pretty bay. And I thought, I'm just going to get up on top of this houseboat and just kind of relax up there. And for anybody that's been on a boat or any type of a boat of any size, the chairs that you have on a boat have those little bitty short stumpy legs on them. So if there's waves and stuff, you don't fall over. So it came with some of those little stumpy legged chairs. And I climbed up a ladder on the back of this thing and took one of those little stumpy chairs up there and set it on top. And it wasn't a big place up on top, but it was flat and it had a rail around it, one place to go down where the ladder was at. And the air conditioning unit was on top, that cooled the inside of it. So of course I took the chair up there and set it up there on that flat spot. And I took a life jacket up there and threw it out because Moose is spoiled, so he'd have to have something to lay on. And then I kind of put him under one arm and I climbed up this ladder and I took him up there with me. And it was beautiful. The water was like glass across there. The animals, the birds and stuff, there's so many different kinds of, aquatic type birds up there. So beautiful. They're doing their normal things and squawking and arguing with each other and doing all that. But the water was so smooth like glass. There wasn't a lick of wind. And it was just really pretty. And I caught it before sunset. And I'm just, sitting up there, relaxing, enjoying myself. Well, when the sun finally got down behind the top of the trees, I mean, it was really pretty. The sky was just red and, it was just beautiful up there. And I'm sitting there relaxing, and all of a sudden behind me, directly behind the houseboat, If you drew a line, you could almost draw it from the back of the houseboat straight through my tent into the woods. There was a loud scream came from the woods up there. And I tell people that if my hair had been long back then, I felt like it would have just blown my hair forward, like I was sitting in front of a speaker or something at a rock concert. And when that thing started screaming, I grabbed the arms of that little chair. I mean, it really shocked my system that bad that when this scream came. Kind of like if you're driving down the road and somebody pulls out in front of you, that kind of a shock to your system. Moose didn't get up, but he turned his head around. He's looking back towards the woods, and that's the good thing about him is he's quiet. He's very quiet. Uh, I've learned from being with him for years in all kinds of situations now. If he barks, that means he's seeing something usually, and you probably need to get up, get moving. It could be a bear if we're in the mountains. If a person just shows up from nowhere, he really just loses his mind and starts barking, even though he's a very gentle, friendly little dog, but he's quiet. Well, when that scream came, he turned around and he's looking up the hill, and I just kind of turned around and I was looking, and I had never heard anything like it before. A very high pitched scream that was a high tone that stayed the same tone the entire time, but it was the length of it that got me because it lasted a good little while. And me having been a singer and especially being in Nashville, being around some really good professional vocalists over the years, I mean, this was really something. I knew that this didn't come from a human being. And I kind of sat there for a second. I'm thinking, what in the world was that? Um, and it was enough to where, long enough to where my system kind of calmed down a little bit. And I kind of, got settled back in my chair and I'm, looking back at the sunset. Otherwise, if I'm turning around looking behind me, I'm just looking right into a jungle. Well, that's when a second scream came. And this time, I'm not saying I was prepared for it, but I was able to hear it from the very start to the very end of it. The duration of it and the volume of it, stuff like that. I get chill bumps even thinking about it now, even though it's been that many years ago now. The second one came, I really listened to it from the start to the end. And I also noticed at the end of it, it was loud enough that it echoed up into a little finger hollow there that we used to turkey hunt sometimes up in there. Incidentally, there used to be an old home place up on that hill one time that we had, found up in there, scouting around hunting. Well, that time, man, I really thought, what in the world? I thought I need to, get something and record this. My cell phone was, of course, there's no cell signal there where we were at, but my cell phone was down in the down inside the boat, and I had it plugged in. That's what it was, charging it. And I thought, man, I got to get down there and maybe I can get my cell phone and, record this. I really was worried about if I climbed down off the top, if Moose would try to follow me because he had never really been on this little boat before. So this stuff's going through my mind. How can I get down there and get my phone? Well, that's when the third scream came. All of them came from the exact same place. They were the exact volume, the exact same sound. And I mean, this thing, it really was a high pitched scream. It sounded like it was angry, when I heard it. The closest thing that I have found to it is something that I acquired later on, and I bring it with me when we go camping now. And it's called an Aztec death whistle. It's what it's called. And that thing, if you blow it, it's just terrifying. It sounds like some type of a banshee screaming. Well, after that third scream, I thought, man, I'm going to get my phone. Moose is going to have to just hang out up here, and I'm going to get the phone. So I oozed out of that little chair. Like I told people, I slid out of that little stumpy legged chair like I had turned to liquid. And eased down onto the top of that little houseboat and was on my belly, literally on my belly, crawling around that little air conditioning unit to get to that ladder to go down. And we're talking about, this little boat's only maybe 7 feet high on on the inside. I thought, I'm going to get to that ladder. When I got around the side of that little air conditioner and I'm looking at the woods and I'm crawling towards the back, that's when the next scream came. And man, that just stopped me right there. I just thought, man, I'm not going to worry about, going down there. By this time, Moose had got up. He's turned around and man, he's looking up there and he's just, it's like he's just froze, looking up there. There's a total of 5 screams took place while I was there. Over a period of maybe 5 to 10 minutes. It really was hard for me to judge time then while all this was going on. But there was a total of 5 screams. On the 5th scream, as soon as it got finished, off to my left, maybe about 30 yards, was the bank across this slough there. And it had really gotten dark enough in the woods to where if you looked at the sky or just looked out across the bay, there's plenty of light. You could still see clearly. But if you looked up into the woods, especially where we were camping at, I mean, it was dark up in there. You just couldn't see up in the woods. After that 5th scream took place, maybe 30 yards off to my left across that little slough, there was the loudest crack. And I explain it to people like this so they'll know what I'm talking about. If you were walking around the woods and picked up a stick off the ground about yay big that you say is semi-rotten, not a green one, but one that's been, laying there a while, I heard the clearest crack right across from me, and you could hear it when it hit the tree. I could hear it when it broke, and I could hear it when it through the air like that, and I heard it hit the ground and roll. That's how close the noise was to me. And of course, that just immediately got my attention, and I started, looking in that direction. And I remember thinking, it was going through my head. I just thought, the first thing, I'm always trying to rationalize it. I thought, gosh, I wonder if there's somebody else over there I mean, surely nobody's camping. Of all the years we've been here, never have we ever seen anybody across that bay. Not camping, not hunting. There's no way to get in there unless you're walking there on foot. So I'm looking over there, and that really is the first thing that came into my mind always was, oh, that must be a person over there. But quickly, I just thought it's not rational to think that there's a person over there, because there just is. And I heard it hit the ground and heard it roll. And the next thing that hit my mind was, I thought, it's so dark up in there, I can't see, but whatever that is has a direct line of sight and can see me. I know it's looking right at me. It has to be. The second that happened, I heard something. I looked to my right, and here comes my buddy around the corner on his kayak, paddling up there, talking. Like I said, he doesn't hear great, so when he talks loud. So he starts talking to me, and I'm still looking at the woods. And when he came up to the little houseboat, I said, "When you go inside, hand me my cell phone out of there." I didn't say anything to him about anything. He goes, "Okay." Well, the first thing he did when he went into the little boat is it had a generator on it to run everything. He fired up the generator on this old used houseboat, and it makes a bunch of racket, just drown out everything. So there really was no use in me trying to record or anything. I didn't say anything to him about it. This was during a really warm time of the year, and we would camp out there. We would camp out up there even when it was hot, and we'd do a lot of our fishing at night when it was cooler and comfortable. But I was prepared to go over, and I had actually gone across as it got dark to get in my little tent over there. And he comes out on the back of this little houseboat, and he says, "Hey man, I got the air going in here. Why don't you just come over here and throw your pad down in your sleeping bag in this little short, tiny hallway in this houseboat. Why don't you just sleep in here tonight? And he didn't have to ask me twice to go back over to that houseboat and get in that houseboat. And I did. And I slept in there. The back door was right there in front of me. And I just kept thinking about something wading across there at night, and coming up on the houseboat. I never said anything to him about it. Well, we packed up the next morning, and we had decided we were going to go back across the bay to our normal spot just because it was grown up over there. And you were kind of stuck on the little boat. There's no place to throw out chairs over there on the bank. And we thought we'll just go back to our spot straight across so we can have a fire. And so moose can, run around, stuff like that. And I just kept thinking about what had happened both times we were there. And we kind of got into it that night while we were sitting there camping. We never really had a disagreement about anything, but we kind of had a disagreement because, man, I wanted to go somewhere else. I wanted to go camp somewhere else or find a different spot and at least give this spot a break or something till this wore off of me or something along that line. And of course, he's kind of stuck in his ways, and he didn't want to, go find a different camping spot. So we had a pretty good argument with each other. I never told him why. I just said, man, I want to go find some other spots to camp at. Well, I hate to say it, but that really is probably the last conversation that we had in person with each other, was when we got into it that night. Now, oddly enough, I probably waited a couple of weeks after that, and I kept thinking about it, and I just thought to myself, something just told me to go back up there, man, just go back up there and camp. So I did. I packed up my stuff, threw Moose in the vehicle, and I drove back to our same camping spot. I really didn't know a lot of places around LBL then, except for that one spot or any place that was on the drive out that dirt road out there to it. So I really didn't know my way around at all. But I packed up my stuff and I, drove out there. When I got down to the campsite, there are certain times of the year at Land Between the Lakes when the Corps of Engineer lets the water down really low. So there's sometimes you'll come and the water's up super high, and other times you'll come and there may be 20 yards of mud or dried mud or whatever the weather is, of beach all the way around the thing. And that's the first thing I noticed when I got there this time, when I drove down in there, was that the water was down super low and there's 20 yards of beach. The first thing that hit my mind was, I'm going up in that slough and I'm going to see if I can find those big giant rocks that were thrown into the water at that time, or maybe I'll see some, by this time I'd done some, like I said, I'd made the mistake and done a bunch of researching and reading stories about LBL. I thought maybe I'll find some tracks or, something along that line. I let Moose out, and man, he just hit the ground running. That long beach, man, he was just out there, having a ball. And I walked around out there maybe 30, 45 minutes, went straight across that first little slough there to see if I could, see anything, big rocks or anything out there. I came back and I thought, I'm going to get camp set up. And I came back and popped the tailgate on the truck, and anybody that's been around me can tell you I'm OCD about things. All my stuff's packed up in totes. So I pulled that first, I have one for cooking, this marked cooking, one for shelter, and everything's in there. I just like to be organized. And I pulled out one tote, my shelter tote, and set that thing down on the ground. And the second that I set that tote down, I just had this feeling hit me all of a sudden that I didn't belong there. I just had this feeling that, man, you don't, not, get out or anything, but I just had the feeling that, man, you don't belong here right now. Something's going on, or something's going to happen. And, and I learned over, many years in my profession that, when the little man speaks to you in your head, you listen to what the little man has to say. I did stay a few minutes to see if I could kind of kick the feeling, but I couldn't kick it. The closer it started getting to dark, I just thought, man, I don't need to be here. I literally put the tote back into the vehicle, loaded moose up, and I went to an established campground at Land Between the Lakes. And for anybody there that knows on here, that knows LBL, I actually went to Piney Campground, which is a campground that you pay to go into. You have to drive through a gate where there's somebody there, because I really didn't know any other place to go. I didn't know any campgrounds or anything back then. So I knew kind of where Piney was. So I drove to Piney Campground, got me a primitive spot, and just camped out there for one night. And since I didn't feel safe staying at the other place for some reason, I just went on home back to Nashville the next day. Well, once again, I got to sitting around, and maybe a couple of weeks later, I had the feeling. I thought, man, I'm going back up there. But I'm just, and the thing that's so funny about it is I had lost probably one of the best friends I ever had, arguing about wanting not to go to this spot, wanting to not stay at this spot anymore. I'm not sure if subliminally I was kind of upset because I didn't feel comfortable telling him anything that had gone on, or anything I'd heard, or that I'd been researching stuff. But sure enough, about 2 weeks later, I thought, I'm heading back up there. And a lot of times when I go to Land Between the Lakes, I'll catch a day when it's raining and it's going to be nice after that. And I will go on the day when it's raining, because I know nobody's going to be there. Nobody's going to be in my spot, in other words. I've never gone to that campsite and had someone there before, but of course, there's always evidence that other people have camped down there. So me and Moose drove up there in the rain. I got stuck on the way in there because it's pretty treacherous when you got past this little cemetery. It's really rutted out on this road. That's why nobody really goes in there. I got stuck on the way in. It took me a while to get out of that. And I finally got down to, the end of the road, at the dead end on the bay there. I got out, let him out. I kind of messed around a few minutes. I felt fine about being down there. I felt like I'm used to, like I normally did. And I got my stuff out, started setting up camp. And it wasn't raining. It was a really cold mist, enough to where if you stood out there long enough, you would get wet, and really cool. I mean, cool outside. I got to put my tent not in my normal spot, but I actually got to put it underneath that big giant oak tree that he always parked his truck under. And that's the first time I've ever put my tent anywhere other than that corner up at the end of this little clearing. So of course I put my tent out there and was able to get a fire going as the sun started going down. Cooked something, had something to eat. Everything's really normal, but everything's quiet because, first of all, it's unusually cool out there. It's raining or misting rain off and on. So it seemed almost like a lot of the animals were, hunkered down somewhere, or they'd been taking a rain all day. So they were just, sitting somewhere trying to stay dry. Well, along about 10:30 or 11 o'clock comes. I've got me a fire going. I'm sitting in the chair. You would think that when you would sit there, you would always face the bay itself when you were there. But for some reason, I always had my back to the bay and I always faced the thicket. I mean, for as long as I camped there, I was always, facing the thicket for some reason. Same thing this night. I'm sitting there. I've got me a chair. I've got the fire going. I'm, facing the thicket. Moose is curled up in his chair. He don't like to be on the ground because he gets cold. And he's curled up a tight ball next to me in this other chair. And we're just sitting there, 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. Well, off in the woods, I estimate it probably about maybe 20, 30 yards. If you were to draw a line from where I was sitting, you would be looking directly through the corner of where my tent usually sits at, right into the thicket there of sweet gums. Off in the woods, about 20 or 30 yards, there was this loud, low, percussive type sound. And this is the way I've always described it to people when I heard it. If you've ever saw one of those big blue giant barrels like they ship cooking oil in or something like that, it sounded like somebody had taken one of those blue barrels and laid it over on its side and had just smacked the bottom of it with a big hand or something. And I mean, it was really a loud, low boom, and it physically shook my body when it did. That's how close it was. Echoed across that bay, even with it that wet out there, just echoed across that bay, that loud thing. Moose, he leaps up, comes out of the chair, starts barking, which that surprised me too. But it was so close and so loud that it was just his natural reaction. Just really loud, and that low sound, it really shook me. And I tell people this, and this is the truth. Maybe about 1 minute I sat there and thought about it for maybe 60 seconds. And about 60 seconds later, I stood up out of that chair and I just looked into the woods and I said, please don't hurt either of us. I said, my little dog is a sweet little dog. He won't hurt you. I won't do anything to hurt you. Just, we're just camping, and, please don't hurt us. When I think back on it, in a way, I think it's so ridiculous that I did that. But also at the time, and because of all the things I'd heard from there, I don't know why. I just felt like I should say something, and that's what I did. Never heard another noise the rest of the night. I was almost afraid to go to bed, but eventually I had to. It got to where it was sprinkling more rain and misting, and everything was dripping, even before I got there that day. And I did. I went and I got in the tent. I always parked to where I'm facing out. It's just something I always did. A lot of times just for convenience sake. But I went and got in the tent. I had moved my vehicle forward enough away from the tent to where I could see that corner where I usually camp at. And at the very bottom of my tent, I had rolled my rain fly up on the bottom, at the bottom of my vestibule, to where if I eased off of my sleeping pad and put my face right against the ground, I could actually see out, of my tent there. But of course, pretty soon I fell asleep. And I'm a light sleeper when we're camping. I'm a pretty light sleeper, but I didn't hear anything else the whole time I was there. I felt, gosh, I was so thankful when I started hearing birds the next morning, because the next morning the sun actually came up. It was supposed to be a nice day. The sun came up. I was so thankful to start hearing birds and stuff because I knew daylight was coming. and it started warming up, and things seemed normal the next day. All the normal aquatic birds were out, things were out hunting. Um, the day before, when I was looking for firewood, I'd actually flipped a pallet over, and it was so cool that there was a black eastern indigo snake under this pallet, and it was so cold that that snake wouldn't move. I picked him up, and he was coiled up, and I literally picked him up, and he never moved. And the next morning, Moose is over there messing around at the edge of that thicket, and it was warm enough to where that snake was even up, you know, you know, out doing its hunting and stuff. So it seemed pretty normal the next day. I spent the next day just doing my regular thing. Did some fishing down there, and actually spent another night. Never didn't hear anything else. And the next night, I didn't have that feeling that I wasn't as nervous, but I was cautious. I will say that that was the last time that I ever camped in that spot. To this day, I've never camped in that spot again. And incidentally, uh, I had some friends that know this story. They did go down there and camp in that spot one time, once or twice after that, and the uh, the Park Service has since gone in and dumped and made it to where that road's impassable, just like the one across the bay was. So we thought that that was kind of odd that they came in there and they dump truckloads of dirt and rock and stuff on that road to where you can't go back in there anymore. Well, so this is what I always tell people. If anybody asks me why I got into to Bigfoot or something like that, that really is the thing that got me thinking and looking into it and got me into it. Well, while doing uh, while doing research, I'm just looking at stuff on the computer and googling stuff on the computer and listening to podcasts. You really have to weed out lots of weird things, and I was raised religious. I'm a religious person. I'm a Christian. There's lots of things that I can't I just can't wrap my mind around simply because of my religious beliefs. I'm a little different now, but several years ago that I just there's lots of things I just couldn't grasp because of my background. Uh, so I found a group eventually of a few people, uh, and I had listened. They had a little podcast where they would have guests on and things along that line. And I started listening to them a little bit and cautiously, uh, because I wanted to try to find people that weren't judgmental. I wanted to try to find people that were friendly to each other, that weren't, like I said, I wanted to find people that didn't just simply dispel any story or something that anybody else came forward with. And little did I know, I kind of caught this group kind of in the infancy of starting their group. And the name of the group is the Beast Group, and that stands for Bigfoot Evidence Analyst Sawdust Team. Well, they have a Facebook page. So I found that group, and if I could, say their names, uh, they were founded by a couple of guys that have been into it for years. A guy named Mark Newble and Larry Porch II are the two guys that started this group. Well, after kind of listening to their podcast and I eventually contacted them via maybe Facebook Messenger or something along that line. And I had comment because a lot of their stories and a lot of things that they talked about had to do with land between the lakes. And it seemed like they had a lot of experience up there and knew a lot of things that went on up there. So that's really what kind of drew me to them. It really was the way that they were is what drew me to them. There's lots of people that had things to do with land between the lakes, but these seem like pretty decent people. And I started really slowly talking to them, and eventually they said, "Well, man, why don't you like tell us, what happened? Tell us your story." So of course I told them the same story that I just told y'all a few minutes ago. Uh, it didn't take long till they contacted me and they said, "How would you like to meet us up at Land Between the Lakes?" And I'm a cautious person. I guess it's just from the profession I had for years. I never have been too crazy about strangers, uh, but I thought, why not? I just thought you can't be too cautious or too proud or whatever it was to try to get around people that have more knowledge than you do on any subject. That was my thinking at the time. So of course I told him, I said, "Well, I would, sure, I'll meet you up there." So really, the first time that we met, one of the guys, he basically forwarded me a pin like you would put on a Google map and said, "We're going to be camping right here where this pin is at." Later on, you find out that there's no phone signal at the majority of Land Between the Lakes. You can't use your GPS, you can't use stuff like that. But he had told me us a general area where they were going to meet, and there was also a guy by the name of Spencer Jameson who had never met them in person before. They had also invited him, and he was driving all the way from Virginia to get there. Me, I was driving a couple of hours just to get up there. So of course I, packed up my stuff, and packed up moose, and uh, and drove up there, and was able to get pretty close to where I thought that they had told us where to meet at, and was hanging around there for a while. Maybe in an hour or so, another vehicle comes down the road, and it ends up being this person who I've become close friends with now, named Spencer Jameson. And I tell people, I go, it's strange because we really did meet the first time on a nondescript road in the middle of LBL. We got out of our trucks and walked over and shook each other's hands, and the only thing that we knew was each other by name and any text that we'd sent each other. And got out of the vehicle. Within 30 minutes, he had never been to Land Between the Lakes. Within 30 minutes, we were already in the woods walking around. Nobody else had gotten there yet. In fact, we didn't really even know that if we were in the right spot or not. We start walking around in the woods and looking at things, and he's very attuned to things like stick structures, tree structures, stick manipulations, and things like that. Things that just really weren't on my radar at the time. And he would start picking out things in the woods that he was seeing. And when he would show it to me and I would get to looking at it, suddenly I would realize that, yeah, this is very strange how, this tree's bent over and something's pinned on the top of it to hold it down, or how these sticks are weaved together in a certain way that nature couldn't have put them together that way. So we're just kind of doing our thing. That's when the rest of the group arrives, and that's the two founding members of our group arrive, and there's two ladies with them also, and some people will recognize these names. There's a lady by the name of Debbie Jones shows up, and also there's a lady by the name of Shelley Reed shows up, and all of these people are members of a long time Bigfoot group that they call the Bigfoot Outlaws. So all these people were members of the Bigfoot Outlaws group, and they showed up. And none of us had ever met before. I mean, this really is the first time we've ever met was here. It's funny. I found out later. I'll go ahead and mention it now. I found out later that they were having us camp at this certain spot for a certain reason. They had really put us in a super hot spot for supposed Bigfoot activity. But of course, they didn't tell us that. They didn't tell Spencer and I that we're going to put you right. We're going to camp out, put you right in the middle of the hottest spot that we know up here. But that's what they had done to us. We eventually we decided we just parked our vehicles right on the side of a road, and Mark just turned around and pointed across the field and said, "Let's go over there into the woods, and that's where we're going to camp." So we literally just walked across a field and right into the woods, out into the middle of the woods, and that's where we set up a camp at. And this was in a late May is when we were doing this. So it's really grown up. It's super buggy and mosquito-y, and LBL is known for its ticks and mosquitoes. And we set up our camp right out in the middle of the woods, built a small fire ring, and there ended up being a total of 4 tents there. And basically these tents made a big circle around this fire ring out in the middle of the woods along a small creek. So that's how we set up. And it was starting to get dark while we were setting up. So we really spent the first evening just kind of sitting around talking and getting to know each other, things along that line. I kept going back to the thing in my mind of, I can't believe that I drove up here and met a bunch of strangers that I don't even know, and I'm out in the middle of the woods with them, but I was. And we got to know each other that night. And the next morning, I mean, we really, as soon as we got up, we hit the ground running. We were in the woods looking for things, and these people had so much knowledge about on the subject. A lot of technology they have going on. If you're out walking in the woods with them, they have GoPros mounted on them, facing behind them. They have recorders going all the time. So I noticed that, and we're just out, just going all day. And when it got dark, we came back and we had something to eat. We're just kind of sitting around camp till it's probably 11 o'clock at night. And all of a sudden, somebody just says, well, let's go. And we just thought, not we, I thought, it's 11 o'clock at night. I mean, what do you mean, let's go? And they said, let's load up, let's go. So they said, man, we're going out boogering. And for anybody that doesn't know it, down here in the South, we call Bigfoot a booger. So we got into our vehicles, and I had no idea what we were going to do or what was going on, but people got into my truck, and people got into one other vehicle, and away we went. And we started, and LBL, especially at night, all the roads look the same. I mean, you're either on a little paved road or you're on a dirt road, and you're surrounded by jungle. It just all looks the same. And we drove, and I followed the person in front of me, and that was Larry Porch II. I just basically followed him, followed his taillights, and we stopped at a spot. They knew exactly where they were going. We stopped at a spot, and it's so dark. It's just so dark there, but yet the stars are so beautiful. There's no light pollution. So if there's no clouds, you can just see the stars so beautiful. And that was one of the first things I noticed and we got out of our vehicles, stood out on what was a little paved road, an LBL back road. And I really couldn't see anything. I didn't know where we were in the park or where, but I could hear water running. So I knew we were close to a creek. And this really is the first time that I've ever heard, other than on television or maybe something online, I'd really heard anybody do a Bigfoot call before. Never knew what calls were. Not that anybody knows what they necessarily mean, but it's the first time I ever really heard anybody do an organized call. And we had stood out there a few minutes, letting everything quieten down. Uh, People have recorders going. Uh, Also, in the meantime, since everything had happened to me at Land Between the Lakes, I had bought a FLIR, a little thermal, uh, because I told myself I'm not going to hear anything in the woods anymore, and not be able to look and see what it is. So I had bought a thermal, a FLIR. So several people, they had FLIRs, they had recorders, they had all kinds of equipment. And that's the first time I'd ever heard anybody do a call before. Um, and in fact, I really didn't even know anybody was going to do a call until the person did it. And I just almost jumped out of my skin because we're standing out there in the dark, and I just wasn't prepared for it. And we didn't hear anything. So my mind, I'm thinking, what in the world, what are we doing, out here? Because with my logical mind and with my background, I really did flip back and forth a lot between, is this really something, or was I just being illogical and making something out of nothing? And that's just the way my mind worked back then. Well, we all loaded up and we drove way around some other roads and made lots of turns and forks in the road. And Larry stops again, and we stop and we all get out on this roadway. We're still on a paved road at this time, and I always tell people we ended up giving this particular place. Uh, it's well known to anybody in our group now. We gave this place the name Firefly Landing because of this particular night that we were there. We got out on this roadway and waited on our vehicles to start cool down and stop popping and making noise. And we're standing between two huge fields on this road. The field off to our right went up at a pretty heavy angle and ended up at woods on the top. And that field was probably 15 or 20 acres in size. It was a huge field. There were deer out there grazing. We could see them on our FLIRs out there grazing. And if you turn to the left, the road dropped off into a lower field. And the reason we call it Firefly Landing is when we looked out across that field, there were so many fireflies out there that when one lit up, it was kind of like the synchronized fireflies that a lot of people have seen in the Smoky Mountains. When one firefly lit up, that entire field would just rush with a wave of fireflies across there. So much so that when those things lit up, you could see each other in the darkness standing on that roadway. That's how many there were out there. So that's why we called it that. So we're just standing there basically looking at the stars and looking at the fireflies and stuff like that. Well, one of the ladies in our group, Shelly, this is the first time I'd ever heard a female do a call before. She came out with a call, and she does great calls. And different people do different calls with different cadences, and there's different syllables to it. I've learned so much just from these people. She did a call, and we didn't hear anything. And once again, I'm thinking, what am I doing, out here? Well, we waited a few more minutes and let everything quiet down again, and then somebody else did a call. And when they did this call, I happened to be standing close to someone that had their recorder going, their little recorder. And when this person let this call go, they had faced the field that had the hill on it that ended up at the woods. And way up at one end of this field, to the left top of this field, the field kind of went off to where you couldn't see it over a hill. And the field was kind of cut up into the woods up there, I found out later on. When he did this call, gosh, it's so hard to describe what I heard back. But it sounded initially like a man yelling up at the top of this hill back down towards us. And the reason I say that is because the first couple of seconds that I started hearing the sound come back, I really thought, they have told somebody where we're going, and they've put somebody up there at the top of the hill, and there's a person up there. I really thought I'm being punked. I mean, I thought they're really, they have to be messing with me. This is going on 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning now. We're all tired, super fatigued, and after about the first 2 seconds, when the sound of that really came down the hill and hit us, I realized that wasn't a man up there. And there was this long yell, and it kind of went into a long howl at the end. And it went on for a pretty significant amount of time. Not only did it howl, but a few seconds later, it howled again, and there was another vocalization came in with it, and it's almost like they were in harmony with each other. They went together and they harmonized, but you could clearly hear the two different ones howling together. And then all of a sudden, the coyotes just started going berserk up there somewhere in the woods. These things that we were listening to were not coyotes. I can assure you that. And I always tell people, even if you have a good recording, because we had several recorders going at this time, even if you have a good recording, it does not do justice to the amount of volume that this had coming from that distance of several hundred yards away up that hill. Well, it finally hit me hard, I kind of said a few choice words, which were recorded onto the guy's recorder next to me. And when the vocalizations would stop, you would actually hear it just echo. It was so loud and had gone on so long. Now, they were used to getting return vocals and hearing vocalizations. This is the first time I'd ever heard anything like that. The screams that I heard, I've never heard again. I've never heard anything that sounds like that again, and had never heard anything like that before. These particular vocalizations that came back down the hill to us this time, I have since heard many times at Land Between the Lakes. And I've always heard them when we have done calls and have evoked a response from something there. What's odd is when that vocalization came down the hill, the first 2 seconds, you're almost, I wouldn't say in disbelief, but you're so surprised that you can't react almost. After a couple of seconds, and once I realized that's not a person up there, that's not something that I know what it is, I really just, for use of better terminology, I've told people, I felt my jaw stiffen up almost like I had a locked jaw. That's the feeling that I got. I was so shaken for a moment. And also something as strange as, according to our recorders that were going, we stayed at that spot 21, 28 minutes, something like that. I had confided in one of the guys later on. I said, how long were we at that spot? They said, we were there about 30 minutes. And I said, I don't know why, but I said, I thought we were only there just maybe 5 or 6 minutes. I said, it feels, for some reason, it seems as if I've kind of lost a little gap of time in there some way, which has also never happened to me before or again. Well, to end the night up, we Uh, we ended up getting some more vocals at that same spot from another corner of a field, but eventually, we just got in our vehicles and left. We went back to where we were camping, and uh, we were tired. We had been going all day. We just stayed up almost all night the night before, just talking. None of us had had any sleep. We were all just absolutely exhausted. And when we got back to camp that night, we didn't start a fire. We didn't sit outside and talk. We didn't do anything. I mean, people went to their tents and just crashed. Well, we had uh, some recorders set out around camp, not in camp, but away from camp. And they camouflage their recorders. They they make things out of wood and bark and stuff to camouflage their recorders. They had some a couple of trail cams out, a plot watcher out, and that's a type of trail cam that you really put it on a field or something, and it shoots like a time lapse of everything that goes on in the field. It doesn't necessarily have to have motion to set it off. It just shoots a long time lapse of the field. So we had one of those going. But one of the ladies in our group, Debbie, and this is a trick that I use now all the time. She had taken some black thread, just sewing thread, and she had strung thread up in a few different locations around camp. I didn't know this. I didn't know she was doing this. And a lot of times when she does this, she doesn't tell anybody she's doing it. That way, nobody knows where her thread is. And she normally threads it up high enough to where she kind of looks at everybody in the group and threads it up higher than the tallest person in the group. That way, even if you're walking through there at night, you don't break the thread. So she had strung up some thread way back behind our camp because we were kind of up on a little peninsula next to this creek, and so she had her thread up out there. And like I said, I'm usually a pretty light sleeper when I'm camping, but I'm telling you, when I got into that tent with the dog, I was out. I was so tired just from running and running the roads. We were just eating off the tailgate. I mean, we were all out tired. So people are snoring. We have a couple of guys that are notorious snorers. They were out. Everybody was just out, including myself. Well, I woke up because I heard footsteps uh, in the brush and leaves and things along that line, like a little twig snap or something like that. And we're close enough to this little creek that we can hear the creek, but it's a small creek. I mean, there's places where you can step across this little creek, so it's nothing that's going to dampen any noise or anything like that. But this was significant enough that I heard footsteps and I woke up. I just woke up in my little tent. We had in camp, right outside of camp, we had a particular tree where the guys would go to relieve themselves and the ladies would go around behind this tree to relieve ourselves. And I heard these footsteps, and they came from a particular direction, and they went between my tent and the person's tent to my right. And basically, these footsteps walked right through the middle of this circle of tents and where the fire pit was at. It just walked right through the middle. And when it got directly in front of my tent, because I'm laying there listening to it, when it got directly in front of my front vestibule on my little tent, it went around and literally stepped and walked within 2 feet of my head, because my head was at that end of the tent and Moose was sleeping on my feet at the other end of the tent. And right there where my head was at was the step off of that little peninsula, and it went back there to where we would go to the bathroom in. So of course the very first thing that I thought, I listened to the footsteps as they came through and went right by my head and took a step off and it went back in there, and I just lost track of it. By this time, I think my mind had told me somebody's getting up, they're going to the bathroom, and man, I just conked back out. Well, the next morning, there's always the thing about, did anybody hear anything at night? Or, because occasionally you'll be laying there at night, maybe you'll hear well, not occasionally, a lot land between the lakes. You'll hear the coyotes pipe up, or sometimes you may sit there and hear some vocalizations or howls. So, of course, the next morning, we're like, did anybody hear anything last night? And I said, man, the only thing I heard was Larry getting up and going to the tree over there, and we're packing up and getting stuff up. And Larry never really looked up. He goes, I didn't get up and go to the tree last night. And I said, well, I thought that you got up and went around and went to the to the to the tree to relieve yourself. And he said, and he never even looked at me. He just said, did you hear the zipper on the tent? And that's really a sound that'll get your attention when you're camping at night. Is if anybody unzips a tent, you really hear the sound of that zipper. And man, when he said that, I realized that no, I didn't hear a zipper. And just like right now, I got chills when he said that. And I said, something walked right through here last night and went within 2 feet of my head. And that's when Debbie had gone back and had noticed that her thread was broken on back behind their tent back up there in the woods. Now, what's kind of funny is we camped at this particular spot, and I didn't really know why they had picked this particular place. And we just happened to be walking back across that little field to our vehicles there. And I was speaking to Mark Newble that was with me. And I said, why did we pick this particular spot, to camp out? And he looked at me, and this is something that I had heard online prior to this. And this is something that I had heard people talk about and that we talk about to this day. He said, well, we're camped out at the Field of 13 Howls. And the Field of 13 Howls is a place that I had heard, but long before, I ever even had Bigfoot on the brain. I had found a recording, an audio recording that someone had done at Land Between the Lakes. It was them recording one night, and they had gotten out, they had did a call, and they started getting responses from a hillside. And they ended up getting a series of 13 howls that came from the top of a hill. And each howl got closer and closer until this thing sounded so angry in the audio and so raspy, and the howls turned to screams, and it got closer and closer to the point to where in the audio recording, somebody actually says, that is a booger. Somebody said that. That's a booger. They whispered as it got closer and closer, screaming. And they're watching this field with their FLIRs at the time, and there were some deer scattered out in that field. And as the screams got closer, all those deer bunched up together, like they were looking for safety in numbers, and bunched up together. And so we thought, at the time, I didn't think it was funny, but now we kind of joke about it. When I said, why did we pick this particular place to camp at? And he goes, because we're camped out at the Field of 13 Howls.